The welfare program that fed 1 million Romans by toldinstone. A welfare program in the Roman Empire. I never thought about it, but at the same time, the Roman are often like, they had a lot of stuff that seems so ahead of their time, Like even now in some country they're not doing it, right? So yeah, I'm not too surprised either. Let's find out. Feeding ancient Rome.
At a time when most cities held only a few thousand people, Rome had 1 million inhabitants. The entire empire at its height had about 70 million, which likely represented about 1/3 of the global total. For centuries, in other words, about 1 in 70 Romans and 1 in 200 human beings lived in the city of Rome.
That's crazy.
Rome was far too large to be fed by its hinterland or even by Italy. From the Middle Republic to the final years of the Western Roman Empire, produce from every part of the Mediterranean basin poured into the imperial city. Olive oil, wine, fish sauce, and luxuries ranging from Indian pepper to hibernating land snails. By one estimate, annual imports of staple
The Roman were into eating snail? Really?
foods alone may have exceeded 400,000 metric tons. Of that figure, around half came in the form of the one indispensable part of every Roman's diet: grain. The ancient Greeks had divided food into 2 categories: bread and things eaten with it. For the Romans, likewise, bread was part of virtually every meal. It has been estimated that the average Roman received 3/4 of his calories in the form of bread and consumed something like 200 kilograms of grain each year.
It's something that's not fully lost in France, I would say, to some extent. Like myself, I'm not a fan of bread at all. I very rarely eat bread. I eat half bread more than I eat real bread. But a lot of like older people, from like before the 2000s, I would say, it still was like, it still is, and sometimes they passed it on to their children. It is still like not that uncommon to have a baguette almost like every meal. And often the idea is that you use it to like clean your plate at the end, if you have sauce or something. So you eat a couple pieces of bread with it. So you still have a normal meal, right? But yeah, a lot of people still, be it for like, the midday meal or the late day meal, they will use bread. It's not that uncommon. I mean, every time, I had to eat with my grandparents, for example, years ago, that would be the norm, right? And like 1 or 2 baguettes would be gone. Yeah. So I guess the tradition not fully gone, even though again, there's still a lot more stuff on the side compared to back then, I assume.
Ancient doctors noted that Roman children often developed bowed legs, a symptom of rickets brought on by a diet that consisted of little but bread. Whenever possible, the Romans ate bread made from wheat. Although wheat was grown widely, only a few regions around the Mediterranean consistently produced surpluses large enough for export. Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa, especially what are now Tunisia and eastern Algeria, all provided Rome with grain. But the great breadbasket, responsible for the majority of the wheat that fed the capital, was Egypt. Most of the provincial grain shipped to Rome was collected as a tax. In Cicero's time, for example, 1/5 of the Sicilian grain harvest was claimed by the government each year. Under the emperors, likewise, wheat farmers in Egypt and North Africa paid their rents in kind, as did the tenants of many imperial estates. Those who paid their taxes in wheat were responsible not only for threshing and winnowing it, but also for delivering it to a state-owned granary. From there, it was forwarded to the coast for transport to Italy. The barges that carried grain to Rome were the supertankers of the ancient world. At a time when the average freighter held about 100 tons of cargo, a large grain barge could carry 1,000 tons or more. During the 2nd century, the author Lucian saw one of these behemoths docked at Athens. It was, he says, 180 feet long and more than 45 feet at the beam, about the size, in other words, of a large ship of the line during the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay.
Although their cargoes were government property,
I had no idea. I obviously always thought that this kind of massive um, not battleship, ship of the line, I think they're called, became a thing much, much later, like in, I don't know, by the time of like the 1400 maybe, and I might be off, but much later than the Roman Empire, right? So that's something. I had no idea there was ship of that size at the time. Okay.
Grain barges were privately owned. To ensure a steady stream of deliveries, the emperors offered captains generous terms, especially if they were willing to sail in winter. St. Paul was on an Egyptian grain barge bound for Rome when an early winter gale shipwrecked him on Malta.
Oh, they are on the Malta.
Most of the Egyptian grain transports traveled together in a massive flotilla.
Yeah.
The appearance of the fast mail ships in its vanguard was an annual cause for celebration at Puteoli, where the fleet docked through the 1st century. Later, after the emperors developed the vast artificial harbor at Portus, wheat from Egypt and the other grain-exporting provinces was landed at the mouth of the Tiber. When grain arrived in Rome, it was stored in colossal warehouses. One of these, the imperially owned Horia Galbana, covered nearly 21,000 square meters. The Colosseum was only slightly larger. We'll discuss how this grain was distributed and the famous grain dole after a few words about this video's sponsor. As Valentine's Day approaches, I'm reminded of the things I love. My wife, my dog, remote Roman ruins, and, of course, Raycon's everyday earbuds. I use the earbuds when I take my dog for walks. Since Raycon's latest model has an impressive 32-hour battery life, I don't have to recharge often. I also appreciate
I'm still like a filthy,
noise cancellation.
Wire
Each pair of
user,
earbuds
right?
comes with a set
And
of different-sized gel tips
it's terrible.
that allow you to customize your fit. I'm also a fan of the protective case cover, which comes in a variety of patterns.
Especially when you try to do like walking out or something and the cable get cut and it's annoying and the earbud get out and all that. It's terrible.
Go to buyraycon.com/toldinstone to get up to 20% off site-wide. That's right.
About 20.
You'll get up to 20% off everything, including all headphones, when you go to buyraycon.com/toldinstone. Returning to our topic. Much of the wheat stored in Rome's warehouses would be dispensed through the famous grain dole. The dole had been introduced in the last years of the Republic when the radical tribune Clodius made grain, already subsidized by the government, free for many members of the Roman plebs. This policy was systematized and refined by Augustus and his successors. Eventually, olive oil, pork, and wine were added.
Free.
Under the emperors, about 200,000 people, roughly a fifth of Rome's population, received free grain every month. Each recipient was given 5 modii, about 33 kilograms, enough to feed one adult. Far from being a sign of poverty, enrollment in the dole was seen as a status symbol, since only Roman citizens who were longtime residents of the capital were eligible.
I was gonna say, like, I found it hard to believe a little bit. Like, it's a bit too much altruistic. There must have been a reason, like, it's mostly for the people who actually have, like, some job that matter or something. And so, like, it's important to keep them around, right? Interesting, though. That's still, like, a lot and just so early in the history of humanity. Well, not that early, but you know what I mean? To have such a system, especially because when you think of, any king, rulers, emperors of the time and all that, I mean, an impression that we all think about, even if they were considered good to an extent, is that, yeah, they wouldn't just give away food for free to the regular people. Like a lot of history, you think of like peasants and plebs just dying of starvation and all that. So this is very unexpected.
Some were so proud of being dole recipients that they inscribed the fact on their tombstones.
Okay.
An official list was kept of those on the dole. Everyone on the list received a token, the tessera frumentaria, which they had to present in order to receive their allotment of grain. Distribution took place at the Porticus Minucia on the Campus Martius. Dole recipients presented their token at one of 44 windows on a designated day of the month. The epitaph of one Roman boy, for example, records that he had received grain on the 10th day at window 39. Until the 3rd century, those on the dole brought their grain to bakers to be milled and baked.
Oh, yeah. So it wasn't
The
ready, yeah.
tomb of Eurysaces, who grew rich turning state-supplied wheat into bread, can still be seen just outside the Porta Maggiore. Under Septimius Severus, the state assumed the tasks of milling and baking. Water-powered grain mills were set up at strategic points in the aqueduct system, and daily distributions of bread replaced monthly handouts of grain. Although only a minority of Rome's inhabitants were enrolled in the dole, all benefited from government measures intended to keep grain cheap. In times of crisis, the emperors set maximum prices, limited the quantities that individuals could buy, and increased the amount dispensed by the dole.
But that's all good
More
stuff, huh?
generally, imperial officials tried to keep bread abundant and affordable by supervising the activities of shippers and bakers. They also released state grain onto the free market at subsidized prices.
Obviously, I know, the world is very different and circumstances and systems are very different, but imagine government doing that today. Like, I mean, some country might have happened, but actually trying to, just for like very, very basic necessities or very, very basic food, like, I don't know, the common one, like rice, pasta, and bread, whatever works the best in the country, actually making sure that it's always like at a reasonable price, that it's, something that you can't just mess around with and, go with crazy prices, as it often happens in some countries. If only some government would be interested in that.
The government controlled the grain market so closely because it had to. Any increase in the price of grain threatened the hundreds of thousands who were not on the dole with deprivation or even starvation. Bread riots were a chronic problem. In 75 BC, a hungry mob threatened to lynch the consuls. More than a century later, another mob pelted Claudius with stale crusts.
Okay.
Besides preventing unrest in their capital, the government subsidized the grain market as a way of confirming Rome's status. Directing the surpluses of the whole Mediterranean world to feed a single city was a way of performing imperial power. It was also a way of demonstrating the special status of the Roman people. Under the Republic,
I see. So it was far from just altruistic. It was really like there was a bunch of other motivation to it. And we see, like, it doesn't change the fact that the result was a good thing, I mean, it's the equivalent of like, like the shitty clickbait YouTubers, who are like, feeding 1,000 homeless, and obviously they're just doing it to get views, like, and attention. But the result is still 1,000 homeless got, fed. So even though it's kind of slimy, the result is still positive. So maybe it's something like that, where like the intention may not have been the most noble in the end. Though I'm sure some people involved in that were doing it for good intention, Actually, I mean, it wasn't a government thing, but I actually, like, when we were young, benefited from something like that. Like, it's a third-party food bank, I think you would call it. In France, it's called the Exotic, which is like the restaurant of the art, I guess, created by like a famous comedian, Coluche, back in the 60s, 70s, maybe. And, when I was young and we were pretty poor, and I guess my parents couldn't afford food or something, we went there quite a few times. And obviously that was very helpful. But I think the thing I remember the most from it is they had like a little bar, and like they would basically offer like hot chocolate to a bunch of kids. And I remember like just drinking 3 of them in a session while my parents were getting the food, right? And, the guy giving the hot chocolate and all that being super nice. And it was just a great experience, of like seeing someone who just seems to really care about people and all that, I just respect this kind of endeavor, right? Food banks and like welfare program, but, with good intention, I guess.
And for 3 centuries after Augustus, Rome was the only conceivable center of the empire.
Yeah.
Its inhabitants had a privileged place, and tradition obligated the emperors to show them special favor. Making bread cheap or free was the best way to do this. The goddess Annona, who personified the grain supply, appeared on imperial coins. Frequently, she was pictured with the prow of a ship, signifying the emperor's role in importing grain from distant provinces. Despite the massive expense of maintaining it, the grain dole survived well into late antiquity. At Constantinople, where a system modeled on Rome's was established by Constantine, the dole persisted until the Persians conquered Egypt. Rome's own dole ended by the Vandal occupation of North Africa, was revived after the fall of the Western Empire by the Gothic king Theodoric, who understood that being a successor of the emperors meant feeding Rome.
That's around the time of Justinian,
You
no?
can join me in Rome this June,
Okay.
when I'm leading a tour of some of the city's most fascinating historical attractions. I'm also bringing a group.
Well, great video. Very, very interesting. I mean, not the kind of thing I really expected. Again, whatever the reasoning was, but that there was such a system so long ago is kind of insanely interesting, yeah? Insanely interesting. Yeah. Hopefully, like, eventually, might not be in our lifetime, but eventually, within the next couple hundreds to thousands of years, if humanity hasn't perished, you know, some, like, this kind of idea of the government or the ruling class, however it looks in the future, you know, doing this kind of thing, and maybe on a wider scale, not just for one city, some kind of, you know, universal right to eat or something, where, like, you know, the government will always make sure that everybody gets fed at the very least. I think could be a pretty great thing. Yeah, a pretty great thing. For sure. For sure, for sure. Okay. Very interesting and very informative. It's always insane the like random Roman thing that you learn about that just it seems so ahead of its time. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. It's really interesting.